This is Lisa from Mobile Tech Review, and today we're smacking down two expensive but really nice laptop computers. On the left we have the 2012 Apple MacBook Pro with Retina display, and on the right we have the Sony VAIO Z. That's the 2012 edition, otherwise known as the VAIO Z3, and they're both running on Ivy Bridge quad-core i7 processors. Now, other than the fact that they're both really nice, they're both very high resolution, and they're both expensive, they don't have as much in common as you might think. Sure, the basics are there. Again, there's that quad-core i7 CPU, and the Sony is 2.1 gigahertz versus 2.3 gigahertz for the Mac. So we're talking not so much of a difference there in performance. It's really not huge at all. They both use SSD drives, and they're custom SSD drives at that, so you can't just go buy one in the store and swap in a different one, and they're available with 256 gigs, 512. The Mac even goes up to 768 for those of you who have lots and lots of money to spend on that. And they both have 8 gigs of DDR3 RAM. Now, that RAM is permanently affixed to the motherboard in both cases now, so you can upgrade afterwards. 8 gigs is all you can order from Sony at the moment. With the Mac, you can actually order it with 16 gigs if you feel that you need that much memory. Both have backlit keyboards. Both have good quality webcams, above average as computers go, and high resolution displays. Now the Sony has a 1080p, 1920 by 1080 display. And it's pretty close to a matte display, so you're not getting any glare or reflections there, and it has a very wide color gamut. That's something that sets them apart, though they're both very nice displays in their own ways. The Sony is the one for color accuracy. You can see just the difference in the blues here. The Mac is rendering off towards the reddish purplish spectrum there, and the Sony is doing it more accurately. But the Sony is 13.1 inches, that's your display size there, and so 1920 by 1080 is about as many pixels as you would want to squeeze into that resolution. Of course, you can set it down to a lower resolution if you're having trouble seeing, or just use font DPI scaling in Windows to help yourself out. And on the Mac, as you can see, we've also got it booted into Windows at the moment. You have that amazing Retina display. That's 2880 pixels by 1800 pixels. And we're not actually running at that resolution right now because things are pretty small. They actually are readable if you set your font scaling to 150%, which is the way Apple sets their drivers up by default to do that, so you don't boot into a resolution that you can't actually see. But we're also running at 1920 by 1080 on the Mac, so they're running at a comparable resolution at the moment. So obviously you have higher possible resolution on the Mac, but that's a 15.4-inch display, so you're talking about more room. You really can't go squeezing that insane amount of pixels into the Sony display. The Mac has a glossy display that can make for some richer looking blacks and the painted on kind of colors, but those of you who hate gloss displays, well, that's something to take into account as well. But Apple did do a good job of reducing glare as things go for a glossy display. Our PPI is 168 on the Sony and 220 on the Mac. Again, when you're talking something as small as the Sony, though, I think it really can't look any sharper or finer. So, pretty close there in terms of the quality of what you're looking at in terms of sharpness. In terms of color, the Sony's going to win. Now, in terms of portability, the Sony really wins because that's why they're a different class of machine. They may both be very nice high-end machines, but the Sony weighs only 2.5 pounds. The whole point of the Sony is to have, say, the equivalent of your 17-inch desktop replacement notebook, but in a 2.5-inch package that's lighter and smaller than than really all Ultrabooks currently on the market, yet it's way smarter than Ultrabooks that depend on ultra-low voltage CPUs that aren't as fast. The Mac with Retina display, it's a 15-inch MacBook Pro shrunk down and on a diet, so it weighs 4.5 pounds, which is light for a Pro machine from Apple, but it's obviously 2 pounds heavier. We're talking almost twice as heavy as the Sony. And it's bigger because it's a 15-inch machine. They're both about the same thickness. So really, it depends on what you're looking for here. The Sony is for somebody who wants that insane portability, that ultra lightweight that travels all the time, whereas the MacBook Pro Retina display is for those of you who travel sometimes, a couple of times, but you're not on the road several times a week or several times a month even. In terms of creature comforts, both of these guys have backlit keyboards and they have ambient light sensors. The Sony uses the ambient light sensor to adjust keyboard brightness all the time. It does a very good job. And if you're not touching the keys, it turns the backlight off on the keys to save power. Though sometimes it makes it a little bit hard to find a key in the dark, but you just tap on one of them once and then you're good to go. Neither of these has super high key travel, but the Sony, that's its weak point. It has very low key travel. Now I find that I can type very quickly on it because You've got very good key size here, large key spacing, and there is plenty of tactile feedback, but those of you who hate very shallow keyboards might not like the Sony so much. MacBook Pro famously has a very good keyboard. I don't think it competes with the ThinkPad, say, for keyboard quality or some of Dell's machines, because again, it's a little bit shallow too, but it's also an excellent keyboard, and obviously you get a little more room to spread out on the keyboard deck and all that kind of thing with a bigger machine. When it comes to trackpads, well, the Mac wins. Whether you're in Windows or Mac OS X, that big glass trackpad with multi-touch gestures that actually work and work reliably is just hard to beat. It's wonderful, even under Windows. The Sony does a pretty good job, actually. It's pretty reliable for clicking, double-clicking, and two-fingered stuff, but you can see it's a quite small trackpad, so you don't have a lot of room here for gestures. Another significant variable, about as important as the size of the machines to some of you, is the lack of built-in dedicated graphics on the Sony. It's just too thin, it's just too small. There's no room, and there's no room for heat dissipation hardware required to put a dedicated GPU inside. Now, Sony sells a portable media dock separately that's $400, also has a Blu-ray drive and some ports like HDMI and USB that gets you a dedicated GPU, but you're going to be tethered to that box, which is about the size of a portable DVD drive. That box will get you mid-rangey performance as mobile graphics go, and the Intel HD 4000 graphics are quite capable, and hopefully you've seen our video of this playing some games at pretty good resolutions. So it is quite capable without the dedicated graphics, but for those of you who are serious video editors or gamers and you really want dedicated graphics, well, the MacBook Pro Retina display is your better choice if you don't mind that larger size and weight, because it has switching graphics as Intel HD 4000 graphics and NVIDIA GeForce GT 650M graphics with a gig of DDR5 video RAM. So you're talking some pretty above mid-range graphics here, and this is a very capable gamer whether you're in Mac OS or Windows. So you'll probably spend more time in Windows if you're a serious gamer because the game selection is bigger there. One thing to note though, if you are booting into Windows, you can only use the NVIDIA graphics card. Apple has not given access to Windows to the Intel HD 4000 graphics for some reason. They've been doing this for quite some time with the MacBook Pros. In terms of ports, again, you'd be surprised, but Sony with this itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny little machine, they actually win when it comes to ports. If you look on the side here, on this side we just have a VGA port, and those of you who still use legacy things like projectors and older monitors will actually appreciate that. These are your heat vents over here. And on this side we've got two USB 3.0 ports. One's a charging port, power jack, full-size HDMI, Ethernet as a drop-down. You've got gigabit Ethernet built in, and here's our 3.5mm jack. And wait, there's more. On the front we have both the memory stick duo slot and an SD card slot on this machine. Now as we look at the Mac, this has lost ports compared to the regular MacBook Pro. Here we have two Thunderbolt ports, and these double as many display ports, so you can get high quality display out on this. We have a USB 3.0 port here. Apple doesn't bother coloring them because they like the aesthetics of not coloring it. And because they're both 3.0, so you don't need to know, we have our 3.5mm jack here. That's the MagSafe power connector. And on this side we have an SD card slot that supports SDXC cards, full-size HDMI port, that's a first for Apple on a Mac notebook, and we have another USB 3.0 port. As you'll note, there is no Ethernet built in here. You're going to have to buy Apple's $29 Thunderbolt to Ethernet adapter to get you gigabit Ethernet there, or buy Apple's companion accessory, shall we say, for this, which is their $1,000 27-inch Thunderbolt display, which has an Ethernet port and a whole lot of other ports on there for you. Now in terms of footprint, you can see we have one on top of the other, and obviously the Sony is going to be a lot smaller, again about the same thickness, but that's what you're looking at in difference in footprint. Now besides that difference in footprint, really the weight is noticeably different in these two. You pick up the Sony and you think this is impossible, there must be nothing inside it, and the Mac feels, well, kind of weighty. When it comes to build quality and materials, both are put together very well. Good seams, nothing out of place, nothing creaking, that kind of thing. The Sony has a metal frame inside and it's carbon fiber top and bottom. Everywhere you look, it's going to be pretty carbon fiber. The Mac, of course, has that unibody aluminum feel. The Mac just feels more solid. There's no flexing, it's absolutely rigid, it feels sturdy. And I've had many Macs with this finish on. I can tell you that it doesn't really show fingerprints, pretty hard to scratch or damage. This is a durable bugger. Now, the Sony, on the other hand, well, it shows fingerprints, it attracts lint. Sony's carbon fiber machines always have, back to the VAIO X, for those of you who remember that ultra teeny atom powered machine. And it's not that it feels flimsy in any way, but it just doesn't feel, well, as metal does. There is some flex in the lid. You can see I can bend it like this, and Sony designs it that way because that way it bends instead of breaking, they say. But again, it doesn't make you feel as confident. One important thing to note is everything is sealed inside on the Mac. The battery is even glued in place, and it costs $199 because you want Apple to replace the battery when it wears out, when it's out of warranty. If it's in warranty, of course, they're going to cover it. But there's no way you're going to do that yourself. It really is impossible to get out. The Sony, it's not a latch release to get it out, but all you do is unscrew these fat slot head screws here, and you can actually pop the battery out yourself and put in another one. Now, in terms of performance, other than the dedicated graphics issue there for those of you who are going to be doing gaming or need that GPU for something on the Mac, the performance is not so far apart. The Sony scores 17,000 on PC Mark Vantage during Windows benchmarks here, and we got 19,100 on the MacBook Pro with Retina display. Now that's boosted up by the dedicated graphics there, obviously. Again, the CPUs are pretty close to being comparable, 2.1 versus 2.3 gigahertz third gen Core i7 CPUs. In 3D Mark Vantage, of course, we're going to see a much bigger difference, and we were pretty impressed with the Sony for scoring 4,000 on PC Mark Vantage with integrated graphics, because integrated graphics don't usually perform pretty well, and that's as good as some mid-rangey dedicated GPUs on notebooks. But the Mac with a GT 650M NVIDIA dedicated graphics card, well, that scored over 10,000, so that puts it right up there firmly in gaming notebook territory among PCs. When we look at Geekbench 2, which is a cross-platform benchmarking tool that can run on Mac and on Windows, they were pretty close, which is surprising, and the Sony actually scored a few hundred points higher. So we're talking, 11,900 versus 12,200 or something like that. So that's a little bit strange there. But again, when you're dealing with cross-platform benchmarks, well, you have to take it with a grain of salt. The Mac really should have scored a little bit faster, unless Geekbench is ignoring the dedicated graphics. Now, both of these machines are fairly pet-friendly, and they do have fans that keep the machines cool and hopefully won't suck in too much cat hair. When you're gaming, they both get noisy. That's the way computers are. They're going to sound a little bit like hand vacs, but neither of them gets alarmingly hot. Both of them each have a hot spot that can exceed 100 degrees. It's between the G and the H keys on the Mac, and there's a little hot spot on the bottom of the Sony, but neither of them overheats. They both run fine. When it comes to battery life, the Sony is the big winner. It does have a smaller display to drive, and that helps. And we're talking about just comparing it now with the Mac running Mac OS, because there you have better power management and you can use the Intel HD 4000 graphics. When it comes to battery life, if you're running Windows, the Sony is going to win. That's because, well, the Mac's going to be running on dedicated graphics the whole time. You're in Windows, you can't use that Intel HD 4000, and Apple's power management has never been super duper great under Windows. Honestly, I'm not so keen on buying a Mac if you really just want to run Windows and you never want to use Mac OS, and there are a variety of reasons for that. I would say there's a great selection of lovely PC notebooks out there. Get one of those instead. You get optimized drivers, you get driver updates, all that kind of good stuff. Anyway, under Windows, you're going to get much better battery life with the Sony VAIO Z 3rd generation. We've been getting close to 6 hours on the Sony, and it's more like 4 hours with the Mac under Windows. Now, if you're running the Mac with Mac OS 10 booted up, then you're starting to get closer. We're seeing about 6 hours for both of these, and sometimes a little bit better than 6 hours for the Mac. Last thing is price. These are both expensive machines, and believe it or not, the Sony starts out cheaper. They used to be, well, pretty expensive brand, but this, thanks to the decoupling of the portable media dock, which isn't so necessary anymore, starts at $15.99. Now you're going to get a Core i5 CPU for that price. If you want the Core i7, you're looking at around $2,000. The $15.99 model gets you the Core i5 and a 128 gig SSD, which is pretty small. It's not easy to fit your life into 128 gigs these days. But if you get the i7 with the 256 gig SSD, then you're looking at close to $2,000. The Mac starts at $21.99 for the base configuration. That gets you the Core i7 quad-core 2.3 gigahertz, 256 gig SSD, and 8 gigs of RAM, same amount of RAM as the Sony. And if you want a faster Core i7 and a 512 gig SSD, you're looking at $27.99. Now both of these machines are configurable, so if you want bigger SSDs, different CPUs, you can order them that way. The Mac tops out at about $37.49 if you go for the 2.7 gigahertz Core i7 with a 768 gig SSD. That's one huge SSD. With the Sony 2, you can exceed $3,000 if you order it with everything possible, including the portable media dock. But generally speaking, the Sony is going to be your slightly more affordable machine here. So that's our Sony VAIO Z 3rd generation versus Apple MacBook Pro with Retina display Smackdown. And it's not really a Smackdown per se. In this case, these are both excellent and expensive machines, so they should be excellent. But it's really what's right for you. Do you need the dedicated graphics? How much is portability important to you? If portability is really important to you, then, well, you can't beat the Sony VAIO Z. Nobody makes anything like this. This is a feat of engineering. The Mac with Retina display, less so a feat of engineering, but more so about putting a whole lot of good performance parts in a beautifully made package with the first of its kind high-resolution display. But the Mac is certainly less portable at 4.5 pounds. That's not too bad, but if you're going to carry that around with you everywhere, you're going to start to notice the weight. And the biggest decider here really should be, do you want to run Mac OS or do you want to run Windows most of the time? Again, the drivers on the Mac work pretty well. We're pretty impressed with Apple's engineering skills there, but they generally don't update the drivers frequently, and you'll get more frequent driver updates from Sony, for example. If you want to do firmware updates, you need to be in Mac OS to update the MacBook Pro with Retina display. It just runs really nice on Mac OS because that's what it was designed to do. Don't forget to watch our video review of both of these machines individually. We have gaming demo videos as well, and to read our full written reviews on mobiletechreview.com.